Welcome to our deep dive today. We're going to be exploring mass movements, but through a bit of a unique lens.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's Eric Hoffer's The True Believer.
I think a lot of people might hear longshoremen and think, what could this guy really have to say? But I think it's pretty fascinating.
Yeah, even Dwight Eisenhower was a fan of Hoffer's work, so
That's pretty huge.
pretty big. I mean, this isn't some ivory tower academic. This is a guy who spent his days on the docks observing human nature in its rawest form.
And I think that's kind of what makes Hoffer so interesting is he's not getting bogged down in the specifics of any one movement or ideology. He's looking for those common threads, the underlying psychology of what drives people to join these movements.
So it's less about the what of a movement, more about the why.
Exactly.
Right.
And one of the things that he argues is really driving this is this desire for change. And it often stems from a sense of personal failure. It's almost like people are projecting their own struggles onto the world, saying, it's not me, it's the system that's broken.
Okay, I could see that. But wouldn't that mean that anyone who's dissatisfied is a potential true believer? What about people who want to improve their own lives, not necessarily overthrow everything?
Well, that's where Hoffer brings in this really interesting point about powerlessness.
Right.
He says, it's not enough to simply be unhappy. You have to feel like you lack the ability to change your own circumstances.
Okay.
It's that feeling of being trapped
Okay, yeah.
that pushes people towards these external sources of hope and change.
So it's discontent plus feeling stuck.
Yeah.
Is that kind of the recipe for a mass movement?
Precisely.
Okay.
And he makes this fascinating distinction between power and faith. He says power alone doesn't really inspire change. You have plenty of powerful people. They're perfectly content to maintain the status quo.
Yeah.
It's faith.
Okay.
This belief in a future that's radically different and better.
So you could have a leader who's super powerful,
Right.
but maybe they just want to keep things the way they are.
Yeah.
It's the leader who can really inspire that faith, even if they don't have all the traditional markers of power.
That's exactly what Hoffer argues.
That's really interesting.
And he gives this great example. He talks about the Industrial Revolution.
Okay.
He says this was a period of massive technological upheaval, but it created this breeding ground for these mass movements because it disrupted existing social structures and it made people believe in the possibility of a completely different world.
So the Industrial Revolution wasn't just about new machines, it was about a new mindset.
Yeah.
People could see that change was possible.
Exactly.
Wow.
And this kind of leads into another point that he makes, which is that practical organizations like businesses, social clubs, they tend to appeal to self-interest. How can I get ahead? How can I improve
my own situation?
Yeah, a lot in life, right. But mass movements attract a different kind of person, someone who craves self-renunciation.
Whoa. Self-renunciation. Okay, is he talking about becoming a monk or something?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
In this context, it's more about a willingness to shed your individual identity, to lose yourself in something larger.
Okay.
He suggests these are folks who feel like their own personal lives are kind of spoiled, like something's
Spoiled?
off or lacking. They're looking to escape those perceived failures and find a new sense of worth by becoming part of something bigger.
So less what's in it for me and more what can I contribute to this bigger thing?
Yeah.
But wouldn't that be a tough sell for a lot of people?
You'd think so, but Hoffer argues that it's actually really effective during the active phase of a movement, the revitalist phase.
Okay.
He says this is when people feel that renewed sense of pride and confidence by identifying with the movement's goals and efforts. It's like this rebirth that they experience through their participation.
I wonder if that sense of belonging is almost addictive. It's what keeps people hooked.
Yeah. It's interesting.
Even when it's really tough.
Hoffer doesn't explicitly say that, but he does make this really interesting point that our intense devotion to something, whether it's a movement, a religion, a sports team even, can be a way of coping with the uncertainty and meaninglessness of life.
Okay, yeah, so we're clinging to something to give our lives meaning when we feel like our own personal lives are missing that.
That's one way to look at it.
Okay.
And this leads to another fascinating observation that he makes, which is about the impact of migration on social stability.
Okay.
He actually argues that easy migration, like we've historically seen in America, can contribute to a sense of stability.
Wait, hold on. So moving around a lot makes a society more stable.
It might seem counterintuitive, but his point is that when people have the ability to move freely, they can escape unsatisfactory circumstances and find a place where they feel like they belong.
Gotcha. Okay.
He contrasts that with mass migration, which he sees as a potential breeding ground for mass movements.
So it's not the movement itself, but the upheaval.
Yeah.
Having to adapt to a new place, that's what makes people kind of vulnerable
Exactly.
to these grand narratives.
It's that feeling of being unmoored. And then speaking of people being unmoored, he goes on to talk about the types of individuals that are most susceptible to the allure of these movements. And he argues that society tends to judge groups by their least worthy members.
Okay.
But it's these so-called undesirables that actually play a huge role in shaping history.
So the people that we might dismiss are actually the ones driving change.
That's what Hoffer would argue.
Well, I bet.
Because they're the ones who are most desperate for change. They see their present as irredeemably broken.
Right.
They're ready to embrace those radical solutions. He particularly points to a category he calls the new poor.
Okay.
People who have experienced this, like, recent decline in their socioeconomic status.
So it's not just being poor, it's that feeling of downward mobility.
Precisely.
Like you're grieving for a lost way of life.
Exactly. And he gives this great example. He talks about the English enclosure movement of the 17th century.
Okay.
Farmers who were dispossessed of their land, they became these prime recruits for Cromwell's army.
Right, because they were angry, they felt cheated,
Exactly.
they wanted things to go back to the way they were.
Precisely.
Okay. But wouldn't that apply to anyone who's experiencing hardship?
Well, he distinguishes the new poor from what he calls the abjectly poor.
Okay.
Those who are constantly struggling just for basic survival. And he says they're actually less likely to be drawn in.
Really? You'd think they'd be the most eager for change.
It seems counterintuitive, but he says that their existence is so precarious, it's perceived as this, like, immutable, eternal order. They can't even conceive of a different reality.
Oh, so it's not just about being poor, it's about how you perceive your poverty.
Exactly.
Oh, that's really interesting.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
And it kind of connects to another point that he makes about frustration in general. He argues that our frustration is actually amplified when we have a lot and want more,
Okay.
or when we're just one thing short of fulfilling our desires.
So the closer we are to our goal, the more it hurts when we fall short.
Exactly. It's about relative deprivation rather than absolute poverty.
Okay.
And this ties into this fascinating concept that he introduces, this distinction between immediate and distant hope.
Okay, break that down for me. What's the difference?
Well, he says the poor, those who are longing for, like, immediate improvements in their material conditions, are more likely to be drawn to movements that promise quick, tangible results.
Right.
But distant hope, that focus on some far-off future, requires a different kind of mindset. It requires patience, discipline, the willingness to kind of delay gratification, which often appeals to those who already have a certain level of stability in their lives.
So the type of hope that a movement is offering determines who it attracts.
Precisely.
Fascinating.
It really is. And then he throws in another really interesting category of potential converts, which is the creative poor.
Okay, the creative poor. Who are they?
These are individuals who possess skills and talents, but find themselves struggling financially despite their abilities.
So, like, their art gives them a sense of purpose, even if it doesn't bring them money.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But, and here's the catch, when their creative endeavors fail to bring them the recognition, the fulfillment they crave,
Okay.
they become vulnerable.
Right, like they need some other outlet.
Exactly. They're seeking to make a bigger impact on the world.
Wow. So we've talked about the desire for change, this search for substitutes, these types of people who are drawn in. But what really motivates people to sacrifice everything for a cause, like to give up their possessions, their relationships, their lives even?
That's a big one.
It is.
That's really getting into the heart of Hoffer's insights, right?
Yeah.
He argues that the power of these mass movements stems from their ability to unify individuals towards a common goal. And that unification often demands a level of self-sacrifice that's pretty remarkable.
Yeah, people willing to die for the cause.
Yeah, even that. But it can also manifest in, less extreme ways, like giving up personal comforts, enduring hardship and persecution, or even severing ties with loved ones who don't share those same beliefs.
So what drives that level of devotion?
Well, he identifies several factors, and they're all kind of intertwined. First, he talks about this importance of shedding one's individual identity, blending into that collective.
So you're not you anymore, you're part of this bigger thing.
Exactly.
But isn't that kind of dehumanizing?
No, it can be. It can definitely have that effect.
Yeah.
But he also points out that this merging of the self with the collective, it can be incredibly empowering for those who feel lost, who feel directionless.
So it's a double-edged sword.
Exactly.
Right.
And this kind of ties into what he calls make-believe.
Make-believe.
Yeah, it's the use of rituals, ceremonies, these grand spectacles to evoke a sense of awe and unity.
So like the theatrical elements of these movements.
Precisely.
Okay, I see that.
You think about massive rallies, parades, marches, all the ways that they create this sense of drama.
Right, yeah, so you create a sense of spectacle,
Yeah.
a shared narrative
Yeah.
that people can buy into.
Exactly.
Yeah, it makes them feel like they're part of something huge.
Exactly.
So you've got the desire for change, you want something more, you need to belong.
Right.
And then these movements come along, and they just provide this ready-made solution.
It's pretty powerful.
It is.
And Hoffer adds another layer to this. He points out that these movements thrive on what he calls a deprecating attitude towards the present.
Okay.
By devaluing the current reality, they create a sense of urgency and make the future seem all the more appealing.
So it's not enough to just offer something better. You have to convince people that the present is so bad
Exactly.
that it's worth sacrificing everything to escape it.
Exactly.
Okay.
And it's interesting that, he contrasts how conservatives and liberals tend to view the present. He argues that conservatives tend to see the present as a continuation of the past, something worth preserving.
Yeah, okay.
While liberals see the present as the stepping stone to a better future.
Okay, so their different perspectives on the present shape their willingness to embrace change.
Exactly.
Conservatives are more cautious, and liberals are more ready to just tear down the old and build the new.
That's one interpretation, yeah. And it connects to this really fascinating concept he introduces, this idea of things which are not.
Okay.
This tendency for these movements to focus on abstract concepts, future promises, these idealized visions, rather than tangible realities.
They're selling a dream,
Exactly.
which may never actually happen.
That's right. But it's that focus on the intangible that really helps to fuel the self-sacrifice.
So, okay.
People become willing to die for something that doesn't yet exist.
Wow, that's powerful.
It is.
But doesn't that make people vulnerable to, like, manipulation?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And that's where the role of doctrine comes in. He argues that absolute faith in a doctrine is essential for driving self-sacrifice.
So it's not about what you believe, it's how intensely you believe it.
Yeah, you got it.
Gotcha.
He says, it is not the truthfulness of the doctrine that matters, but rather its certitude and ability to inspire unwavering belief.
Oh, okay.
So doubt
Yeah.
becomes the enemy.
Right. So you can't question it. If
Exactly.
you have any doubts, it's over.
And this brings us to one of his most, I think, intriguing observations about the role of fanatics in mass movements.
Okay.
And he doesn't use this term fanatic in a purely negative way. He recognizes that they're often the ones who are willing to go to the most extreme lengths for a cause.
So fanatics are actually essential for starting these movements.
That's exactly what he argues.
Wow, okay.
He says their single-mindedness and their unwavering conviction, it's necessary to kind of break down that old order
Okay.
and inspire that drastic action. But he also says, and this is kind of funny, the fanatic is not a stickler for principle, but for a cause to cling to.
So it doesn't matter what they believe in, they just need something
Exactly.
to believe in.
Okay, it's that fervor, that's what matters.
So it's almost like the content is secondary.
Exactly.
It's that intensity of the belief that matters.
And this actually connects to what he says about kind of the eventual fate of these movements.
Okay.
He argues that they often have a limited lifespan
Okay.
because that initial fervor and unity inevitably wanes.
Right.
They either transform into something more stable or they kind of fade away.
Interesting. So what happens to the fanatics then?
Well, Hoffer kind of suggests that their strength lies in destruction, not creation.
Right.
They're great at tearing things down,
Yeah.
not so good at building things up.
Right.
So once the movement needs more nuanced leadership, they kind of fade into the background.
Or they become a problem.
Exactly.
Okay. So who takes over then?
Well, that's where he brings in the practical men of action.
Okay.
These are the guys who are drawn to movements that are already showing signs of success. Okay.
They bring order, stability. They institutionalize the movement's ideals.
They're like the architects, the builders.
Yeah, they're the ones who can take that raw energy and channel it into something more lasting.
But wouldn't that create a lot of tension?
Absolutely.
You've got the people who want to burn everything down.
Right.
And then you've got the people who are coming in to actually, like, build something.
It's an inherent tension.
Yeah.
And he argues that this tension is really central to the life cycle of these movements.
Okay.
As it grows, it inevitably attracts a wider range of people with different motivations, skills, and goals.
Right.
You get that internal conflict.
Yeah.
The true believers clash with the pragmatists.
So a movement almost has to betray its original ideals in order to survive.
That's a common pattern, he observes.
Wow.
Yeah, that initial fervor, the idealism.
Right.
It gives way to this more pragmatic approach.
So they become the thing that they were fighting against.
It's a question he leaves us grappling with, right?
Right. He doesn't give a simple answer,
Yeah.
but he gives us a framework
Good.
to understand what's happening.
Yeah.
He shows us that the seeds of a movement's downfall are often sown in its very success.
Yeah, that's deep.
It is. And the same forces that propel it forward can also lead to its decline.
This is all starting to feel a bit too real for me. I'm thinking about all the movements and ideologies that are swirling around us today.
It is pretty relevant, isn't it?
It is. It's making me think about all the ways that people are being drawn into these collective narratives.
That's a great observation and a perfect segue into what we're going to talk about next.
Okay.
You know, we've been talking about how these movements gain traction, how they unify people and inspire action, but what about the specific tactics they use?
Yeah, how they get things done.
Exactly.
Yeah.
How do they go from a bunch of frustrated individuals to a force that can actually change the world?
Yeah, that's what I want to know.
That's where things get really interesting. It really makes you think, doesn't it? It gets even more complicated when you consider that the very things that help a movement gain power can also lead to its decline.
Okay, I'm curious. What are some of those paradoxical elements?
Well, let's talk about unifying agents.
Okay.
The forces that bring people together and make them act collectively.
Okay.
And Hoffer argues that one of the most potent unifiers is hatred.
Hatred. That's pretty intense.
Mm-hmm.
Is he talking about like blind rage? Or is there something, I don't know, a little more nuance there?
I mean, it's definitely a powerful emotion, but Hoffer's point is that hatred, in the context of mass movements, it acts as a kind of social glue.
Okay.
It creates this us versus them dynamic,
Okay.
where people can kind of subsume their personal identities into this larger collective that's defined by its opposition to a common enemy.
So it's like finding a shared target for all that frustration and anger that we were talking about.
Exactly.
It gives people a sense of purpose, a feeling like they're fighting for something important.
Exactly. And Hoffer emphasizes that this enemy can't just be like some abstract concept.
Right.
He actually uses the term devil to describe it,
Devil.
suggesting that it needs to be this tangible, readily identifiable entity that represents a genuine threat.
So you create a villain
Yeah.
that everyone can rally against.
Exactly. And by framing the opposition as this devil, it not only justifies the movement's actions,
Okay.
but it also creates this sense of urgency, this righteousness.
Oh, yeah.
It becomes a battle of good versus evil.
Right, yeah.
A fight for the very soul of society.
It definitely simplifies things,
Right.
creates those clear lines in the sand, motivates people to take action.
Exactly.
But isn't that a bit dangerous? Don't we lose something important when we reduce everything to like black and white,
Yeah.
good versus evil?
That's the danger that Hoffer points out. While it can be incredibly effective for mobilizing support,
Right.
it can make it really hard to have nuanced dialogue,
Okay.
to see the humanity in those who hold opposing views.
Right.
It creates this climate of intolerance.
Okay, yeah. So it's a powerful tool, but it can be misused.
Exactly.
All right.
And this kind of connects to another fascinating concept that Hoffer explores, which is the role of imitation in these movements.
Imitation. Okay.
Yeah.
So we're naturally drawn to imitate other people, especially people we admire. But how does that play out, I don't know, in a mass movement?
Well, imagine you're someone who's just feeling really frustrated with your life, with the state of the world,
Okay.
and you see this movement that's gaining momentum.
Yeah.
It's attracting these really passionate followers,
Okay.
and they seem to be making a difference.
Right.
You might be drawn to imitate them, to adopt their beliefs, their behaviors as a way of, kind of finding your own place.
So you're following a blueprint,
Yeah,
a prepackaged set of beliefs and actions.
exactly. It eliminates that need to kind of figure things out for yourself.
Right. So it's comforting in a way.
It is.
Yeah.
It provides a sense of belonging, this shortcut to meaning and purpose.
But are we all just mindless sheep,
That's a great question.
blindly following the herd? Like, does Hoffer think we have no agency in this process?
Not necessarily.
Yeah.
He actually points out that a strong sense of individuality, a feeling of superiority, can counteract this tendency to imitate.
Okay.
People who are confident in their own identities, their own beliefs,
Right.
they're less likely to be swayed.
Okay. So having like a strong sense of self can kind of protect you.
It can, but here's the catch.
Okay.
He also argues that certain types of unification, those that are achieved through persuasion, coercion, or even just this kind of spontaneous surrender, they can actually intensify those imitative tendencies.
Wait, so when people feel pressured to conform, they're more likely to follow the crowd?
It seems counterintuitive, but,
Yeah.
when we're feeling uncertain, vulnerable, we tend to look to others for guidance.
Right.
And that guidance, it can lead us down a pretty dangerous path sometimes.
Ugh, that's a bit scary.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about hatred, imitation. These are like these powerful forces that can bring people together under a movement.
Yeah.
But where does it all start? Like, what sparks that initial flame?
That's a great question. And Hoffer's answer might surprise you.
Yeah.
He argues that these movements don't just, erupt spontaneously. They're carefully nurtured, often over long periods of time, by individuals he calls men of words.
Men of words.
Yeah.
So like writers, intellectuals, orators.
Exactly.
People who are shaping the narrative.
Yes.
Planting the seeds of discontent.
Exactly. These are the folks who articulate the grievances, they expose the flaws in the existing order, and they offer this compelling vision of a different future.
So they're not necessarily the ones leading the charge, but they're like laying the groundwork.
That's a great way to put it. They're the ones tilling the soil,
Yeah.
planting the seeds. They might not be around to see the harvest.
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
And their success really depends on their ability to tap into those existing anxieties and aspirations that are already kind of simmering within society.
Okay.
They have to be able to articulate the unspoken fears and desires of the masses.
So it's not just about having ideas. You have to know how to communicate them in a way that really moves people.
Exactly. You have to create a sense of urgency,
Right.
sense of possibility. And he gives this fascinating historical example. He points out that the rise of mass movements in the late 19th and early 20th centuries,
Okay.
it was partly fueled by the emergence of new forms of media,
Like what?
newspapers,
Yeah.
radio,
Okay.
these new technologies that allowed these men of words to reach a much wider audience.
So it's not just what you say, but how you say it and how many people you can reach.
Exactly. It's about controlling the narrative,
Right.
amplifying it through these channels of mass communication.
Okay.
And that brings us back to the role of the leader.
Okay.
While the men of words might lay the groundwork, it's often the charismatic leader who emerges
Okay.
to galvanize the masses.
Right. So they're the ones who take all that intellectual framework, all that energy, and they turn it into something real.
Precisely. They're the ones who kind of bring it all together. And Hoffer argues that a successful leader needs to create a compelling narrative, one that simplifies complex problems, identifies a clear enemy, and offers a path to salvation.
Right.
They need to be able to evoke those strong emotions,
Yeah.
inspire loyalty,
Okay.
instill that sense of urgency.
So it's a combination of intellectual, prowess,
Yeah.
but also emotional intelligence and strategic cunning. You have to understand how to tap into like the deepest desires and fears of people
You got it.
and use that. Yeah.
That's a brilliant way to put it. And it's important to note that this doesn't mean that all successful leaders are saints.
Right.
Or even particularly well-intentioned.
Yeah.
Hoffer acknowledges that some of the most effective leaders throughout history have been ruthless, manipulative, even cruel.
So it takes a bit of darkness sometimes to really ignite a movement.
That seems to be one of the unfortunate truths that he highlights. He's not condoning it, of course,
Right.
but he's just acknowledging that these tactics can be really effective.
Okay. Yeah. And so what about the average person who gets, swept up in these movements? What's their role?
That's a great question. Are they just pawns?
Right.
Or do they have some agency?
Right.
And Hoffer argues that they're essential.
Okay.
The masses are essential.
Okay.
They provide the movement with its energy, its momentum, its legitimacy.
They're the ones who actually do the work.
Yeah. They're the ones who turn that leader's vision into a reality.
Okay.
And they're often the ones who bear the brunt of the sacrifices.
So they're the true believers, the ones who put their lives on the line.
Exactly. But he's careful to point out that this doesn't mean they're mindless or easily manipulated.
Okay.
He argues that they're drawn to movements that offer them something that they really crave. A sense of belonging, purpose, meaning.
So they're not just following blindly.
Right.
They're looking for something that, I don't know, maybe fills a void in their life.
Yeah.
Okay.
Connects them to something bigger.
Yeah.
And this brings us back to this idea of self-renunciation that we discussed.
Right.
By joining a movement, individuals are essentially surrendering a part of themselves to that collective. They're giving up their individuality
Okay.
in exchange for belonging.
And that surrender isn't always completely voluntary, is it?
That's a really good point, and Hoffer acknowledges that.
Yeah.
You know, there can be social pressure,
Yeah.
coercion,
Right.
but he also emphasizes that even in those cases,
Right.
there's often an element of genuine belief there. People are drawn to these movements because they offer something that resonates, whether it's longing for change, search for meaning, a need to belong.
So it's a mix of individual psychology and social dynamics.
Yeah.
Strategic manipulation. It's complicated.
It's not a simple case of good versus evil, leaders versus followers.
Right.
It's much more nuanced than that. Yeah, it's messy.
It is.
But that's what makes Hoffer's analysis so valuable.
Right.
Yeah. He's not offering simple answers. He's just presenting this view of human behavior it's really thought-provoking.
And unsettling.
Yeah, definitely unsettling.
But it challenges us to really think about what's going on.
Yeah. And so we've talked about how these movements gain traction,
Yeah.
how they bring people together, inspire action.
Right.
But what about the specific tactics they use?
Yeah. How do they actually get stuff done?
Exactly. How do they go from a bunch of frustrated individuals to a source that can actually change the world?
That's where things get really interesting.
How do they do it? How do these movements actually translate all that, like fervor and belief,
Yeah.
into concrete action? How do they go from being just a bunch of, I don't know, frustrated individuals to a force that can actually reshape the world?
Well, you know how we were talking about fanatics earlier and how they're like great at destruction, but not so much at creation.
Right. Right.
Well, Hoffer argues that this is where what he calls the practical men of action come in.
Okay.
They're drawn to these movements once they're already showing signs of success.
Okay.
They're not necessarily driven by that same kind of like burning zeal as the fanatics.
Right.
But they're the skilled organizers, the builders, the ones who can turn that chaotic burst of energy into something structured, something functional.
So they're like the architects, the engineers who come in after the demolition crew has done its job. They take all that raw energy and they kind of like channel it into something a little more sustainable.
That's a fantastic analogy. Think about it. To build a lasting movement, you need more than just passionate believers.
Right.
You need people who can create systems, establish hierarchies, manage resources, people who know how to navigate the complexities of power.
But wouldn't that create like some friction within the movement?
Absolutely.
You got the folks who want to tear everything down, and then you have these folks who are coming in to build something new. Those are totally opposite impulses.
And Hoffer argues that this tension is actually inherent in the life cycle of most mass movements.
Okay.
As a movement grows, it inevitably attracts this like wider range of individuals with different motivations, different skills, different goals, and this leads to conflict.
Right, because the true believers might feel like the movement has lost its way.
Exactly.
They clash with the pragmatists who are more concerned with, like holding on to power.
Exactly. That initial fervor, that idealism, it often gives way to a more pragmatic approach.
So it's like a movement has to betray its original ideals in order to actually survive.
It's a pattern that he observes again and again.
Wow. That's pretty depressing.
It can be.
So are all movements destined to become the very thing that they were trying to overthrow?
Well, that's the question that Hoffer really leaves us grappling with.
Yeah.
He doesn't give a simple answer.
Right.
But he gives us the framework.
Yeah.
He shows us how those seeds of a movement's downfall are often sown in its very success.
The things that make it great are also the things that, like, destroy it.
The same forces that propel it forward can also lead to its decline.
Wow. Okay. That's a lot to think about.
It is. But it's a reminder that even the most well-intentioned movements are, like, susceptible to corruption.
Mm-hmm.
Power changes people.
Yeah. It's a bit unsettling, but I guess it's a good reminder to be, like, skeptical, to question things, not to just take everything at face value.
Absolutely.
So as we wrap up our deep dives into the true believer, what are some of the, the big takeaways that you hope people will, like, walk away with? What are some of the things from Hoffer's work that we can apply to our own lives, to the world around us?
Well, I think one of the most important takeaways is that mass movements, even though they might have very different ideologies, very different goals, they share some really fundamental characteristics.
Okay.
They're driven by these kind of like predictable psychological and social forces that we can learn to recognize.
Yeah.
And by developing that awareness, we can become more discerning, more critical, and ultimately, I think, more conscious participants in shaping the world around us.
So it's not about like condemning all mass movements.
Right.
It's about understanding what makes them tick.
Exactly. It's about developing a more nuanced perspective.
Yeah.
One that allows us to see both the potential and the perils of collective action.
I like that.
And I think Hoffer's work gives us this really powerful lens through which we can, kind of look at the world.
Yeah.
A way of making sense of this complex interplay between psychology, social forces, and political power. And with that understanding, we can make better choices about how we engage with the world.
That's fantastic. Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. We've explored the motivations, the tactics, the potential pitfalls of mass movements. I think as we try to navigate this increasingly complex and interconnected world, Hoffer's insights offer this really valuable guide. This reminder that the human heart, with all of its contradictions and all of its complexities, is really at the center of it all.
Absolutely.
So as you're encountering different movements, different ideologies in your own life, remember Hoffer's challenge. Observe, question, think critically. And who knows, maybe you'll even surprise yourself with the things you uncover.